So my name's Tony Lykke from HRT, and I'm here to talk to you about fixing on call when nobody thinks it's too broken. So what do I mean when I say broken? Well, this is the monthly page count for a particular team at my company. If you squint, and the slides weren't cut off at the top, you might be able to see the scale of the y-axis, which tops out at 2,400. That's right, 2,400. Someone had a really bad month in July 2015. That's 2,327 pages, 581 a week, 83 a day, 3.5 an hour for a whole month. But it's barely an outlier, with 19 of 56 months having more than 1,000 pages. And this over here on the right is the state it's in now. About 1,000 pages total over 4 months, coming out to an average of a little over 50 a week, a 4 times reduction. Now, I only have 30 minutes to talk, so there's only so much I can cover. I'm only really going to discuss how I reduced pager noise while trying to give you some soundbitey wisdom to take home with you. I'm not going to tell you why you should do this. If you're here, I'm assuming you probably already know the obvious reasons. I'll try and give you some general advice you can hopefully apply no matter what monitoring stack you use. We still use Nagios 3. I hope you don't. So the technical details aren't really that helpful here. In fact, this talk is light on technical details in general because when a pager is this bad, the problems aren't technical, they're cultural. So, a bit about me before we get started. Fresh out of university, Atlassian gave me root SSH access to their entire cloud on a now defunct team called Service Operations. We received tens of pages a week, mostly unactionable noise. The team was dissolving, so I was exposed to the process of finding owners for and handing off tens of services as the company internally transitioned to you build it, you run it. I then moved to Jira SRE, where we received almost always less than 10 pages a week, there was limited noise, and there was active pushback against new sources. I left Atlassian after about 18 months to move to New York and work for Hudson River Trading, or HRT, where I've been since October 2017 as an SRE on the trade systems team. That's it, no decades of experience here, just 3 years in industry. They say you're supposed to have a slide like this in your presentation anyway, but to be honest, most of the time I feel like this. If you haven't heard of HRT before, we're an automated trading firm that trades all manner of assets such as stocks, derivatives, foreign currencies, and crypto. The automated part means that we don't have a traditional trading desk where people place orders, but instead we have what we call algo developers who train models that run as close as possible to exchanges around the world placing orders. These automated strategies buy and sell hundreds of millions of shares a day across about 100 markets worldwide. Domestically, we make up over 5% of the daily US equities volume. If you work on cloud software, you might be used to thinking of response times in milliseconds, but we mostly talk in the nano and microsecond ranges. It's often pretty difficult to quantify the financial impact of an outage at your average cloud provider. Not so at HRT. We have a pretty good idea of how much money each machine makes given certain market conditions, and so it's easy to make a remarkably accurate estimate of how much an outage or something causing performance degradation actually costs. And we do all this with about 300 people across 10 offices around the world, with our headquarters in downtown Manhattan. So, the trade systems team is responsible for our global trading infrastructure. We run thousands of machines across tens of colos, and when I started, we received hundreds of pages a week. This is the rolling monthly page count from 2012 to mid-2018. These are not alert counts, these are not emails, this does not include low urgency, these are all high urgency pages, sent to PagerDuty to alert someone that something requires urgent attention, possibly waking them up in the middle of the night. We as a company have also grown a lot over this time. So the early days were especially bad when you consider that we operated many times fewer machines and in generally much less complicated configurations than we do today. So, a couple of months after I started at HRT, I watched my teammate that was on call purposely ignoring her phone as it slowly vibrated its way across the lunch table. At this point, I'd been sitting in the shadows watching and hearing about noisy pages, but I didn't truly appreciate the gravity of the situation. I asked how many pages a week they get. Hundreds was the response. Somewhat shocked, I said, you know, you don't have to get paged so much, right? There is a better way. The response was a little something like this. They just didn't believe me. So naturally, I wanted to find out why. That's just how it's always been. Feels kind of like an institutionalized type of alert fatigue that's so advanced it's almost sentient. I like to call this one snowflake noise, alerts or noise that only exist because of a perceived or real uniqueness between systems. The typical way to fix this is by standardizing systems, often with fancy words like virtualization, immutable infrastructure, and config as code. But we run everything on bare metal, so perhaps this statement has some credence, just not to the tune of 200 pages a week. This one comes from people who read the Google SRE book and whose immediate reaction was, this is great for all those people living in Google's operational utopia, but none of this is possible for us mere mortals starting from scratch. The problem is that this is patently untrue. It's almost never a resourcing problem, but instead a prioritization problem. More specifically, it's a failure to recognize the resource constraints that a noisy pager itself creates. Poor on-call quality of life makes it hard to hire and retain good people, and it also reduces the quality and quantity of work they can do. Reducing pager noise will actually net you more resources, and they'll be happier and more productive ones too. It's better than it used to be. I don't know how many times I heard this one. People had come before me, made some improvements, and moved on to other projects. They spoke of their time working on Nagios like it was a rite of passage. Many had spent months toiling and ultimately decided that either more effort wasn't worth it or that the problem wasn't solvable. So, presentation best practices say you need an overview, but if the internet has taught us anything in the last 10 years, it's that clickbait titles work. I couldn't quite bring myself to make this the title of the talk, so here it is 10 slides in instead. So I'll start by talking about the information gathering phase, where you build an understanding of the problem you're actually facing. Then we'll move on to coming up with a plan and maybe asking for permission before actually diving in and improving things. Now you might be sitting there thinking, Tony, this doesn't sound very agile. Can't I just skip all this and just move fast and break things? Well, the answer is no, and step one will tell you why. So, it was clear at this point that the attitude towards alerts on my team was unlike anything I'd experienced before. When I was on a team with a noisy pager at Atlassian, there was a shared understanding that the noise was bad, and there was an active effort to reduce it. When I moved to Jira SRE, there was less noise, and there was constant pushback against new potential sources. And yet, at HRT, where the pager was an order of magnitude noisier than anything I'd ever seen before, there was this feeling of acceptance, as if the problem was somehow intractable and everyone was weirdly okay with that. On-call had been so consistently noisy for so long that people took a lack of alerts as a sign that things were broken. Downtime was rarely actually set for planned maintenance for various reasons, and this was sometimes defended as, I kid you not, verifying that the monitoring works. Whatever I did to reduce noise would clearly not be successful if I didn't take this culture into account. A desire to reduce on-call noise isn't something that I brought up out of nowhere. Many times since starting, I'd pointed out that on-call at HRT seemed to be quite burdensome, often resulting in a lengthy discussion about my past experiences. Everyone I spoke to was so convinced the problem wasn't fixable that I started to wonder whether maybe I was the one that was crazy. They raised some good points during this time though, things I hadn't considered coming from the cloud world. It took me a long time to accept the fact that our production failover scenarios often involve manual intervention, for example. And that sometimes that's okay. When you're running a SaaS in the cloud and you lose a machine, your autoscaler can just replace it. Not us though. We have finite space and, more importantly, power in our colos. So we run with as little redundancy as we can. Adding new machines can take weeks, and machine failure often means removing some trading strategies from the colo, which is an art in itself, hence kind of manual. All of this really culminated in the general opinion that my time would be better spent on, well, anything else. There was also some things that I was hired with the intent of doing, so there was this pressure for me to move towards those instead of wasting my time with Nagios. I knew I had to convince at least somebody that this was not only a productive use of my time, but arguably the most valuable thing I could be doing. The last thing to understand about people on call is that they will almost always lean towards conservative approaches. It's in our blood. We feel responsible for the systems we go on call for, and the vast majority of problems are caused by change, so it naturally follows that we're wary of change. Embracing this cautious nature is crucial to success, and later I'll discuss some approaches that I've found success with. So PagerDuty maintains an alarmingly long history of incidents. Get it? Alarmingly? If you're sending them from Nagios, like we have been for years, then they'll also already be populated with critical information like hostname and service name. We have a script that runs daily that imports historic alerts into an Elasticsearch index, which allowed me to do useful visualizations like this one. Now, I mentioned earlier that people had previously done work to try, often unsuccessfully, to improve on call, and this script is one example of that. I didn't create it. It already existed before I came along, created by one of my teammates to facilitate sending daily pager summary emails, with the intent of reducing noise. So this is probably the best example of surprising things that actually looking at the data uncovered. This graph is a histogram of the number of pages bucketed by hour of day in GMT for about a year. What you might immediately notice is that there's a quiet period there that's about 8 hours long. This is actually the approximate US market hours. I say approximate because the graph is in GMT and market hours are based on Eastern Time, which is subject to daylight savings. What's really curious is the pager is the noisiest outside of US market hours, which is when we actually care the least about problems because they're generally far less urgent and much easier to deal with. The other interesting thing this graph shows is that shortly after the US market closes, there's an immediate spike in alerts. This is our daily market data consolidation jobs running all around the world, feeding data from our colos into long-term storage for later use in our research environment. Digging into the data behind this spike, I found that the vast majority of alerts around this time were not actual check failures, but instead were check timeouts caused by this data consolidation pegging the machines and saturating the network. We're running Nagios 3 in 2019. The last release was in 2012, and it sure feels like it. We have 30 geographically diverse satellites running a total of around 40,000 checks, submitting those results back to a central master Nagios server. About half of this 200,000 lines is programmatically copied to the master before deployment because of how we do HA, and a quarter or so is duplicated to all satellites but rarely changes. So in reality, it's closer to about 50,000 lines of actual config, but that's still a lot. As you can imagine, swathes of this config is duplicated. The unofficial process to spin up a new satellite for a colo was to choose another similar-ish kind of one, copy its config directory, and replace the 3-letter colo code. This led to various ad hoc tweaks, typos, and other variations being propagated through some satellite configs and not others over the course of the decade or so since we started using Nagios. This hugely complicated system was then, naturally, deployed manually via rsync. Well, sometimes. Turns out it was also not deployed sometimes because people would forget to include satellites and there was no documentation around which files to include and where to sync them to. The result of this is that adding or changing checks was incredibly tedious, involving copying your config changes to 30+ files, remembering where and how to sync them, accidentally overriding some ad hoc change someone made to the production config but never checked into Git, and praying to whichever god you believe in that you didn't screw it up, before ultimately giving up and deciding that you didn't need that new check anyway. So this step is where you get to exercise those rarely used project management muscles. The idea here is that the previous steps, building understanding, have at least broadly given you some direction, which you can then use to convince those that need to be convinced. I'm not suggesting that you need to plan everything down to each and every sprint, spending hours in Jira making tickets and arranging them in order of priority, just that you should take some time to come up with a high-level plan of attack that can be ideally communicated to those involved. During the facts gathering phases, did you find things that can be fixed without any functional changes? In my case, it was standardizing those 200,000 lines of config, the first steps of which involved whitespace and definition reordering changes that can be considered very low risk. The need to communicate is especially true if you're doing this as an outsider like I was. When I started this project, I'd been at HRT for a mere 5 months, and I wasn't even on call. Without communication, I was just another Yahoo coming in to shake things up and make myself look good. All that being said, be sure to weigh up the feedback against the data you've been reviewing. That's not to say you should ignore it, but remembering that on-call heroes are conservative, it follows that they'll be resistant to such radical change. It's your job to make sure the change is safer and less radical, or at least it seems that way. I had one of the people carrying the pager I was trying to fix literally say to me that I was wasting my time and they thought I should drop the project. Fast forward 6 months and they're now one of my biggest advocates. So, here's the broad strokes of my initial game plan in picture form. First, simplify and clean up the existing config so it's not so much of a burden to maintain. Then, extend the existing Python script that sends alerts from Nagios to PagerDuty to make it easier to silence and otherwise intelligently handle alerts so that they don't page so unnecessarily. I'm a big believer in asking for forgiveness instead of permission. But you should use your best judgment here, and please don't angrily tweet me if you decide to go sit in a corner for 6 months smashing code without talking to anyone and get yourself fired. What you should do is ask yourself the following. Do you have enough leniency to just do things like this? Does your team trust your judgment? If your manager has a micromanagement style, this step might not actually be optional. How much time can you spend before someone starts asking questions? Will you have good answers to those questions when they come? Maybe you'll be better positioned to get real permission with a proof of concept. Did you already spend all your available goodwill on the previous information gathering steps? If the problem is bad enough to warrant fixing, then there should be data to support that. If there isn't, then the problem either isn't that bad, or you need to go back and reevaluate how the data was collected and whether it is accurate. 15 to 20 minutes per page. This is the number I use to quantify the actual impact of not fixing a problem. It's an estimate that I'm sure some people in this room would say is way too low, and does not include the softer, more difficult to quantify impacts like sleep deprivation from a noisy overnight shift or employee morale. You might get rejected initially. Keep pushing. It might take a while to convince people that it's worth fixing. Ask pressing questions about noise. Was there some scheduled maintenance on the weekend that created a 100-page alert storm but was completely unactionable? Bring it up, discuss it openly. Make people think about noise when it happens instead of automatically dismissing it as just the way things are. I said earlier that on-call people have a preference for conservative approaches to problems. This wasn't obvious to me initially. In fact, I had to learn it the hard way. When I started pushing against the team culture of alerts being okay, I was met with skepticism and what I perceived at the time to be negativity, but in retrospect was actually just conservatism. I made the mistake of somewhat dismissing these concerns, and it was nearly the death of the project. You will break things. It is inevitable. You can be as careful as you like and it will still happen. It's not enough to come up with risk mitigation strategies and rollout plans. You need to make sure the people on call are aware. I didn't at first, so when I broke some things early in the project that I thought were relatively minor, there were some complaints. Didn't these people realize how much effort I'd put into making safe changes? It would have been so much easier to just YOLO this stuff into prod, but I didn't. I'd been careful and contemplating. I'd taken the time to do things safely, but when you're changing such critical infrastructure, even small problems are going to be noticed. Couldn't they see I was trying to do right by them? And then it dawned on me. Of course they couldn't see. I hadn't told them anything except, I'm doing this, it'll be good for you. It's when I realized I am not a smart man. So I started telling the team everything I was doing. This included extensively documenting how to use everything I was changing, blog posts explaining current status and future plans, ridiculously long pull request messages detailing intent of changes, known risks, planned mitigations and rollout strategies, and of course the fabled post-mortem when I accidentally broke paging for nearly a whole day. Oops. Noisy pages are often the result of neglect, and neglect creates technical debt. I mentioned earlier that there was something like 200,000 lines of Nagios config, much of it duplicated. Making changes in this environment was tedious and error-prone, and as a result, nobody really did it. The manual deployment process caused its own inconsistencies between environments as well. I knew I had to make it trivial to make and deploy config changes before anything else, but I also knew that doing so would have little or no direct impact on actually reducing noise, hence Groundwork. The safest change I could come up with that still served this goal was to template the Nagios config. This involved about 20,000 lines of whitespace and ordering-only changes broken into many separate logical commits, catapulting me onto the Git leaderboard for the repo, which we all know is the perfect metric for measuring programmers. By the time I was done templating, I'd replaced about 15,000 lines of duplicated config with 400 lines of Python and about 900 lines of templates. The details of how are largely uninteresting. As I said before, I hope we're one of the few places still running such an old stack. I also turned the manual deployment process into an automated CI-like build and deploy with pre-flight checks to enforce consistency and remove the burden of deployment from fallible humans. Now that the groundwork has been laid and we're apparently 2/3 of the way through the process without actually having made a single measurable improvement to the pager, it's time to start actually fixing things. Revisit the data from earlier and, using a combination of intuition and knowledge of the systems you're working with, choose the lowest hanging fruit. There's no hard and fast rule for choosing what to work on here in my experience, but as a general rule, you want to choose things that are less risky, take less time to do, and have the biggest impact on noise. What this actually ends up being will depend heavily on your environment and the data you've uncovered already, so I can't really give any better guidance than this. Visualizations are your friend here though. Most of the low-hanging fruit is probably hiding in these graphs that you made during the data gathering phases, right? You remember? And other ad hoc visualizations that they inspire. In our specific case, it was this graph of pages caused by checks timing out by the hour of day that they occurred. It was already known that the daily data consolidation caused alert noise, but this graph really highlighted how much. Some things had been done previously to try and alleviate the noise, like spreading out cron jobs on the noisiest of colos, but they didn't address the actual problem, which was we just don't care about alerts at this time of day. The solution is simple then, right? Just ignore pages when the data consolidation jobs are running. I won't bore you with the implementation details, but if you look closely at this graph, you can see when the change rolled out. This particular host was one of the worst and most consistent offenders, paging multiple times a day most days and always at the same time. This was about 8 months ago and it hasn't paged since. So naturally at this point, you want to ask, what's it feel like to be a hero? Right? You know, Hollywood told me it'd feel something like this. Turns out it actually felt a little bit more like this. Why? So, despite all the announcements, wiki pages, and commit messages, I still hadn't communicated enough. So, let's revisit communication then. We've got blog posts, RFCs for newly proposed things to silence, documentation coming out the wazoo, long and detailed PR descriptions that also included detailed and safe rollout plans. So why the hell did everyone still seem so worried? After talking to some people, I discovered that radio silence from the pager had always meant something was broken. The reason people were still anxious about these changes, despite all the communication, was that the silence for them was historically an indicator that something in the monitoring stack was broken. I had essentially overnight cut the number of pages received in half. The daily handoff between geos started noting that things were quiet, but didn't yet feel like it was in a good way. The instinct was to think something was wrong. To understand, you need to remember that these people have had the idea of noisy being okay beaten into them over the course of a decade or so. They were skeptical. Their first thought wasn't, yay, more time to do real work, but instead, where did all the alerts go? It was clear I had to wean them off the noise. The solution? Create a Slack channel and send all the noise there. You might think that sounds like I'm just redefining noise, but the culture around this channel is very important. Initially, some people set it to ping them for all messages, but quickly learnt that wasn't an effective strategy because it was just far too noisy. This isn't a channel for warnings or lower urgency stuff. It's more like a log of what is silenced so people can see that things are happening even if they're not getting paged. These days, people just tend to leave it as a muted channel, making it easy to ignore when not on call, and something you can occasionally check in on at your convenience when you're on call, or not at all. There's no obligation to be in this channel. This has proven to be a very useful strategy for mitigating silence anxiety. Early on, it was common for discussions to take place in this channel in response to particular messages about alerts, as we tweaked the silencing rules. But these days, it is mostly just a place where silenced alerts get dumped that's largely ignored. Congratulations! If you've made it this far, you've probably made someone's life a little bit easier. Now go back and do it again. Improvement is iterative and incremental. So going back to this slide from earlier, this is what the system used to look like. And this is what it looks like now. There's no huge structural changes here. Really, it's just less lenient now on what's allowed to go and actually wake someone up in the middle of the night. First going through a series of drop, downgrade, and grouping filters before being allowed to page. If you forgot to take notes, here are the dot points to take away. Gather data about your alerts and pages if you don't already. Try to get historic data if you can. PagerDuty at least supports it. Feed it into something that lets you visualize it, like an Elk Stack or Splunk. Review the data. Build visualizations. Dig into it, driven by what you think you already know, but be prepared to be surprised by what you find out. Make a plan based on what you found. Maybe ask for permission. Aim for the things that are easiest and have the biggest impact first. Communicate constantly. If you think you're communicating enough, think again. If people are resistant to the idea of change, maybe it's because you haven't communicated enough. Do it, can't really help there, and then submit a talk to SREcon about your experience. If I can do it, so can you. All jokes aside, after a short 6 months at HRT, I was able to make a huge impact on quality of life and productivity for a bunch of people, and I'd be lying if I said it wasn't rewarding. We've got an endless list of opportunities for improvement like this. If you want to enjoy coming to work as much as I do, swing by our booth or check us out online. If you've got questions or feedback about my talk or just want to chat, feel free to find me afterwards in the lobby, please, so we don't interrupt the next person coming up, or email me directly, or I'm at TL on the SREcon Slack. Thank you.